Okay, hello everybody. Dr. Sharad Paul is a skin cancer surgeon, a skin care expert, a family physician, an academic, an evolutionary biologist, a storyteller, and a social entrepreneur. Born in England, he spent his childhood in India and is a global citizen who now lives down under. He has received numerous awards, including a Health Innovation Award from the New Zealand Ministry of Health and the New Zealand Medical Association Chairs Award, as well as the Co-Avatia Excellence Award for leading health improvement on a global scale. He has been called a Renaissance man by New Zealand Herald's Canvas magazine. In addition to his skin surgery clinic patients, Dr. Paul performs over 7,000 skin cancer checks every year. He also finds time to fund literacy programs in schools and teaches creative writing to disadvantaged children in local schools every week. He is here today to speak to us about the fascinating history of the human skin and the changes it undertook every time the future of a species was at stake. Dr. Paul peels away artificial divisions to lay open the genetic chains that bind races and species together. I'm very, very happy to welcome him today. Over to you, Dr. Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you. My latest book, which you can see there, is called The Genetics of Health. But where this journey started was as a skin physician and somebody who specializes in skin cancer, I realized that you can't have bad health and good skin, and vice versa. So really, a skin is just our envelope. It just reflects what's going on inside. So that was the story, and my main interest is evolutionary biology and how we can look through the eyes of science at the world, and we can get answers to many of the questions we have. And so I'm going to take you on a little journey, which is a little bit of my own scientific and personal journey. So the part of this lecture is based on my previous book, which was called Skin, a Biography, which is really the biography of skin. And as you can see in the picture there, I also work on animals. So I perform reconstructive surgery on animals when they get injured. So I guess if you have traveled in many different parts of the world, and I was born in England, and I grew up in India, then I work now in Australia and New Zealand. So maybe we're looking at that. Sometimes I'd explain to people that I'm not a monkey doctor. See, the first thing about skin is you have the science and you have the emotion. And everybody's got a bit of both when it comes to skin. So for me, the interest in skin is the science. See, skin is our only universal organ. There are many creatures which have no hearts. There are many creatures which have no brains. They're still living. They still have likes and dislikes. But they all have skin. But skin is also our largest organ, and it is our only essential organ. See, for example, you can live without eyesight, you can live without smell, you can live without taste, but you cannot live without touch. So that's our only essential organ. So for me, the science of skin as a nervous organ is really the most significant thing. But everyone else who comes to see me, they have much more of an emotional attachment to skin. So almost every time I go somewhere else, like I was at a pub last year in Dublin at the literary festival, and the publican said to me, "Doctor, we saw you coming, and my wife's gone home to get our daughters." Everybody was just coming up and pulling up their tops and showing me their rashes on their back. So I had this very busy practice in a pub in Dublin. So I guess everybody, in some ways, you can't be a skin doctor and not be busy, because everyone's got some problem with their skin. Everyone thinks either it's very good or very bad, or something could be improved. So like I said, this journey starts at the bottom of the ocean, because all life evolved at the bottom of the sea. So the first creature we come across is a starfish. And the reason I chose the starfish for a study was the starfish actually has no heart. It's a heartless creature, but it loves oysters. So it loves shucking oysters rather heartlessly. But the starfish, what I found interesting is a starfish, he's got a lot of vitamin D receptors. And the first question I asked myself is, this is a creature at the bottom of the ocean. It's not exposed to much light, this particular kind of starfish. Why do they need vitamin D receptors? So the second creature we come across is a sea squirt. Now, a sea squirt is a very interesting creature because I think a sea squirt gives us a parable for life in some ways, because a sea squirt has two forms. So if you look at it in a different form, it's got a lot of tentacles, so it actually moves around the bottom of the ocean till it finds a rock it falls in love with. So it falls in love with this rock, and it grabs hold of it, and it never lets go. And once it becomes immobile, it starts digesting its brain. So you see, the reason for that is the brain evolved for movement. So there is a moral of the story here. So that is basically, if you're going to get married to your rock and you're going to sit in front of a TV and just eat a packet of chips, you may as well eat your brain. But more seriously, what it means is the brain evolved for movement. And as we'll see down this journey, I'll explain how it pertains to your skin. Now, the other interesting thing I found is a creature like a sea squirt, again at the bottom of the ocean, immobile, again had vitamin D receptors. So that took me to the next question. Is vitamin D really a vitamin, or is it a hormone? So I put a picture of a sheep. It's supposed to be a wolf in sheep's clothing, but that's because I come from New Zealand, where we have more sheep than people. Right. So see, vitamin D is actually an imposter because it's not a vitamin, because vitamins are things we can't produce on our bodies, so we need it from our diet. But vitamin D we produce on exposure to sunlight. So that's really where I got interested, because we had these creatures which were never exposed to sunlight at the bottom of the ocean having vitamin D receptors. Now, why this is important is if you look at the calcium concentration of seawater, it's 20 times the calcium concentration of fresh water. And then fresh water has more calcium than on land. So when creatures originally evolved underwater and migrated onto fresh water and then onto land, they needed a calcium regulator. And that's what vitamin D is. So if you don't have adequate levels of vitamin D, you either end up with too much calcium or too little calcium. And we'll talk about how it impacts your health and, indeed, your skin. So the first part of this is I'm going to tell you a story which is really the battle between two vitamins. And this really shapes our universe. So 100,000 years ago, modern man came out of Africa. Now, the first thing to remember, like I said, is the brain evolved for movement. So what made human beings different? We started walking two-legged. And we started walking two-legged, we covered greater distances. And when we covered greater distances, our brain became bigger, because the brain was all about movement. So human beings traversed larger parts of the earth than any other creature, and we developed a larger brain. But as you know, brain is nothing but a computer. So the larger your brain, the larger the cooling system you need. So that's why we lost fur and we just retained hair. And the reason we retained hair is because hair is like a warning system when insects sit on you and things like that. So we've done experiments where you shave off hair and your rate of picking up insect bites is less than when you have a little bit of hair on you. But you see, the reason we lost fur is because we could not have body heat at that level when we had a computer which was functioning, but it was too warm and for an optimal. So what happened is, as human beings started losing their fur, the skin darkened. The reason the skin darkened is evolution is all about fitness. What fitness means is not physical fitness, but what it means is your ability to propagate your genes. So the first thing the women in the audience will know is you need folic acid to reproduce, otherwise you get birth defects. And if you expose folic acid to light, it gets destroyed. So therefore, the skin darkened to protect folic acid. So that's how skin became dark in Africa, because it was a sunny continent. People were walking all over the place. Over time, the skin darkened over many, many, many years. So I actually first started writing this book when I was operating on primates. And what I found is when we used to shave their skin under the fur, their skin was pink. And I thought it was very strange. You would expect their skin to be darker. It didn't need to be because they had this big fur layer. So what that meant is as these people then migrated into Europe, the second problem was there's not enough sunlight. Many parts of Europe, there was no sun for 6 months. So the skin lightened to absorb vitamin D. Now what happened, the people who were darker skinned, they developed rickets because they could not absorb enough vitamin D. And if you develop rickets, rickets is a double whammy. On one hand, you get bent over and stooped because of skeletal defect problems. On the other, you become infertile. So if you get infertile, obviously you're not going to reproduce. And if you get bent and stooped over and you're shorter, so that's where the feelings of racial superiority originally came, because the people who were darker skinned in Europe were actually deceased. So what happened is people then migrated 10,000 years ago into Asia. And once again, the skin darkened because, again, they were going to a sunny climate. And once again, the skin darkened again to preserve folic acid. But here was something different, is these people migrated out of Europe where they didn't have large sunny conditions. So unlike in Africa, they didn't have these thousands of years to produce pre-vitamin D levels. So what is interesting here is if you take somebody of identical skin color from Africa and identical skin color in India, say South India, what you would find is the Africans have 4 times the vitamin D levels. And vitamin D, as you know, improves your muscle recovery, skeletal muscle strength, your athletic ability. So the first part, if you look at it, is so we can actually predict all the populations of the world just based on your folic acid levels. So we did a study. We looked at a slum in Bombay, and we looked at the wealthiest suburb in Belgium. And guess what? The slum in Bombay had 20 times less birth defects than the wealthy suburb because they were just darker skinned. So that's why you look at a lot of these European countries have negative growth rates. And that's why you look at Asia and Africa, and you see large populations. You immediately think, oh, there's no education. If you are dark-skinned, because you preserve folic acid, you're naturally a breeder. You're much more easily because you have less birth defects. In the Western countries, if you just think like where I live in New Zealand, when somebody just imagines they're going to get pregnant, they started on folic acid. Back home in India, virtually nobody used to take folic acid, but it didn't affect them. So the second part is, so like I said, the Asian skin uniquely came out of European skin, so they actually all have very low vitamin D levels. So I was actually thinking about it because before the London Olympics here, I actually predicted the track and field medals based on the skin color or where the origins were. And so if you look at it, people in India, you know that the Jamaicans, of course, do very well. And then you look at this Bag Milkha Bag. For people in India, of course, it was a story, inspirational story of Milkha Singh, whose family was torn apart in partition, and his family was slaughtered. He literally ran to India, and he became India's greatest middle-distance runner. So in the Olympics, he finished 4th, and he broke the Olympic record. But unfortunately, the other 3 ahead of him also broke the record. So with 1.3 billion people, India is the only country which has never won one track and field medal. So the real reason is this. If you want to do that, we have to supplement babies 50,000 international units because fundamentally we've got no vitamin D. And large vegetarian population doesn't help. So really, we'll talk about the implications for this are very important because if you look at the Asian population, especially the Indian subcontinent population, and you go back to what I said earlier about vitamin D being a calcium regulator. So let's just say you have low calcium let's say you have low vitamin D because of your skin type. And you're consuming calcium like in dairy. In India, everybody likes drinking milk and eating yogurt and things like that. So what you find is when you don't have your calcium regulator, the vitamin D, and you're consuming yogurt, that calcium goes straight into your cells and lines your arteries. So it actually directly correlates with your risk of heart disease and diabetes. And that's why in India we have a massive explosion of. So when my book was written a few years ago, it took 2 years after that before the first studies came out of Bombay. And they said there were 75,000 heart attacks could have been prevented if they just corrected people's vitamin D levels. So actually, if you look around the world, you can predict things like populations, Olympic track and field medals, just based on our origins. So this is what we call the calcium paradox. So people are consuming calcium, but they're developing diseases because the calcium doesn't get absorbed properly, or it goes into your arteries because you don't have a regulator. So the next question I'm going to tell you is I'm going to tell you where Darwin was wrong. Because what Darwin wrote in the Descent of Man was he said that he saw the Aborigines in Australia, and he saw the Eskimos, and he saw obviously they were dark-skinned. So he thought, well, you can be wherever in the world and you can have different skin colors, and that's fine. Because he wasn't looking at skin, or he wasn't looking at the world through the eyes of skin with which I'm coming here. So what I thought is, like Nayanika said, one day a week I teach children how to read and write. And these are children who typically don't do well at school, so I teach them creative writing because, you know, if you can improve somebody's creativity, it helps their math and science. And so for a few years, I ended up working for UNESCO. So I was actually reading the story to the children, and the story was called The Polar Bear Son. And here I was thinking, you know, there's something interesting about the story is there's always a good trick question to ask children is you always ask them, what color is the skin of a polar bear? And everyone goes white because it's white. But you shave a polar bear and the skin is jet black. Right, it's the fur which is white. And the reason for that is the fur has been bleached by the high UV at the North Pole. So we have high UV in the North Pole and we have high UV in the South Pole. But where I come from, Australia and New Zealand, we have a high skin cancer rate, but we don't have a high skin cancer rate in the North Pole. Why is that if they both have got high UV? The answer is because in the North Pole, you've got Arctic Ocean, so it's water, so it absorbs it. Whereas Antarctica is like sheets of ice, so it reflects it back into the atmosphere. So anyway, so here's what's interesting. So you have the Inuit who've got dark skin, and you've got the polar bear who's got dark skin, but they live in Europe. How is it possible? How was my theory could be possibly right? So to prove this, I found myself at the Miss World competition, but it was purely for research. So what I said before I went there is that I'm going to look at Miss Norway and I'm going to look at Miss Estonia, and we're going to see who's got the better tan. Now, this is a very important scientific issue because I'll tell you why. It's because if you look at Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, those are the 3 Baltic states, the currents coming into the Baltic current is much warmer than the surrounding currents in that part of Europe. So when people first migrated out of Africa and went into Europe, they were able to farm grain in those places. But other places around it were too cold. So in Norway and Iceland, people were just clubbing whales and seals and eating them, whereas here they were farming grain. And guess what? If you farm grain, and grain has no vitamin D, so these 3 countries are the whitest countries in Europe because over time, their skin lightened to absorb more vitamin D. So now you look at this in the context of that, we look at the caste system in India. So there's a picture I found in a library when I was in India, and of course the darker person says beggar and the other lighter skin says Brahmin. But if you think about it, the upper class were vegetarians. So what happens is over time, you're not consuming any vitamin D, so your skin lightens over time for you to absorb some vitamin D. So it doesn't, you can't eat your way to whiteness in 1 generation. So it takes about 400 years. So what happens over 400 or 500 years, your skin lightens. So the perception came that if you are lighter skinned, you were a little upper class. So that's how the perception in Asia, or especially in the Indian subcontinent, the original thing was predates colonialism, where people thought, you know, we need to be lighter skinned. It's really because if you're lighter skinned, you were seen as being more upper class. And that's got everything to do with the diet. So like I was saying, that's why these countries in Europe have lighter skin. Everything can be explained. So really, in the end of it, when we look at it, you know, we're all the same. There is no, when we look at every other part of our body, our hearts, our kidneys, our livers, our brain, all the same. It's everything about nurture and nature and how you look after it. And that's really what my next book is about, is what we eat and drink can shape our genes and cause new gene expressions. And so there's no real difference. So skin color is really, the thing which I find astounding is, so if you look at the melanin, which is what makes my skin my color or your skin your color, all of us have got the same amount of melanin. So you could be a redhead who's freckled, you got the same amount of melanin as a dark-skinned person, except it's just scattered more differently. But the total weight of this melanin is just 1.4 grams. I mean, that's how ridiculous feelings of racial superiority are. So like I say, you know, I like to say that there is biology on one hand, and there's bigotry, and biology has got no bias. So people, the whole world would be so much better if we could just understand this very simple fact. I found that interesting picture because there may be a genetic thing to being a doctor, but in my family, my grandparents, great-grandparents, I have a great-great-grandmother who did medicine in a time when women and men did the same course, but women were called licensed medical practitioners. They weren't allowed to be called doctors. And so she was an LMP. So the only one who escaped the gene of being a doctor was my grandfather, who was a pastor. But I found this thing of him wearing this ridiculous-looking turban. And from the part of India he came, and they didn't used to wear those turbans. So I remember asking my dad, why is that? And that was because he was asked to go on a tour of America. And they said that he had to wear a turban in the southern states so that he wouldn't get lynched. So this was during the era of slavery. So I just put it up there to show that, you see, because wearing the turban meant he was exotic, so he wasn't just a slave, right? No, but you see, there's another way in my new book we're talking about this is there are lots of other implications from these things which have till today in our health which we don't realize. So for example, I found a painting in France, the Louvre, people who used to buy slaves, the slave buyers used to lick their faces to choose them. So the more salty you tasted, the higher price you commanded. And the reason for that is because they were put in the hold of a ship, terrible conditions. Most of them died of dehydration. So the salt retainers didn't die of dehydration. So what happened is, but now if you put all these people artificially in one area, so in the US, you have a large African-American population who have the salt-retaining gene, which actually I have, by the way. I tested my own, so I probably would have made a good slave. But what happens is, but in Africa, it's not so concentrated. So actually, so if you put African Americans on a high salt diet with processed food and junk food, they have much higher disease of heart rate and diabetes than you would in Africa. And you see, so the legacy of this is actually far greater, which is the things which I talk about in the book and we can talk about later. So that's another book I wrote before this and between the skin one. It's called Democracy, and that's really a specific guide for people with Indian or subcontinental skin. I also had a poetry book on melanoma, of all things, and that was really a poem from it. And I thought I'd put it up, and I'll actually read the first and the last one, because I think it really is a message for us in society. I'm saying democracy, I'm saying equality. World's not saying fraternity, it doesn't talk. Not epidermis, nor dermis, nor genes separate us, but scientific truths remain unspoken. I'm saying science, I'm seeing emotion. Skin doesn't choose partners, it doesn't talk. But we see skin color when we long for somebody's presence, whether it's a black truth or a white lie. So there is a TED talk on this topic, which I was just saying. So if you've forgotten what I said, or you weren't concentrating, or you couldn't hear me here, you can find it online. All right, so thank you very much for listening. And I think Nayanika is going to interview me now. So where is she? I'm fine. Sorry? Yeah, sure.
Okay, so that was really fascinating, Sharad. And I have actually been reading your new book, The Genetics of Health. And I've been staying up nights trying to, I'm supposed to be doing lots of stuff, but I couldn't stop reading this book. And it has really made me reevaluate a lot of my lifestyle choices. So what this book is about, to tell us a little bit about it. Firstly, you're a doctor, but over here, what I like about this book is that you haven't dismissed alternative thought, like a lot of doctors tend to do. You haven't distinguished, you've made a distinction between health and medicine.
Yes, I think it's because, like I said, science has no bias. So, you have to be open to the other possibilities. And basically, why I differentiated health from medicine is, see, after I did medicine, I actually studied law and majored in philosophy and ethics. So I'm actually full of useless information, right? But what I found is medicine and law were very similar because they were very old-fashioned guilds. So they had restrictions, sets of rules, very difficult for people to access. So you can't just find a lawyer. You can't just find a good doctor. But what I found is there was a distinct difference. So the thing I look at it is just like law doesn't always translate to justice unless you have money. Medicine won't always translate to good health unless you take personal responsibility. So I think the way I'm looking at in the book is, as you would see in different chapters, are on psychological issues, the stress response, skin. It's on eating for your gene type. So all of us have different gene types, and if people are interested, in the book, there's more details of how you can do your own genetic profile if you're interested. But if not, there's enough general stuff on it. So I think the idea is we don't take enough responsibility. I mean, I find it astounding that somebody will come to see me, and I say to them, are you on any medications? And they're like, I'm on this pink pill, I'm on this blue pill, I'm on this yellow pill. And I'm like, I'm not a pharmacist. I mean, you're just putting stuff in your body, and you don't even know what it's for. I mean, I find it astounding. Yeah.
I also was astounded by something else. You talk about a gene for procrastination, and I think I must have that gene because I'm always procrastinating. But tell us a little bit about that.
Actually, it's interesting. In that chapter, there are 3 different types of lazy genes, right? So the procrastination one is actually survived because the procrastinators, so when you look at 100,000 years ago when man left Africa, life was very dangerous. So 1 in 20 people died because of predators, right? There were saber-toothed cats running around. So just like we passed on the stress gene or the anxiety gene, because the anxious ones were still in the caves. They were like, I'm not going to go and fight this tiger, it's going to get me. So you survived, and you passed on your genes. Likewise, the procrastinators were in there, my spear is not sharp enough, it's never going to lance this tiger, and guess what? You survived, and the other guys died. So it is actually true that we have passed on more of our stress and procrastination genes, but they're actually survival genes. But speaking of laziness, there are different genes. See, first thing I must say is genes are a blueprint, but they're not our destiny. So you can overcome it. So when we put mice on a treadmill, and these mice have a particular gene, SLC, a solid carrier kind of a gene, D3. What it does is this gene, we know that reduces dopamine coming out of the cells. So it means that you become a couch potato, right? But if you put these mice on a treadmill, over time, they start expressing different genes. So you actually have the ability to turn on and off different genes. So just because if you're a procrastinator, you can't work your way through it.
Right, I thought there was no way out. I could just blame it. You talk about the benefit of dance, and in particularly the tango. Tell us about how we can dance, why dance is so important.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what I said earlier about the brain evolved for movement. And the fundamental thing which differentiates, it's actually my original title for this book was Revolution, and R had an X, and then because it's an American publisher, they wanted to simplify it. Then I said the genetics of being human, which is really it's all about. So what made us human was the fact that we are two-legged. And if you think about it, when you're two-legged, what it means is you have to balance. So we've got 3 purposes of movement. One is locomotion, so we're walking. But when we're walking two-legged, we've got to balance. And that's why if you lose your sense of balance when you're older, you have a higher rate of falls. And thirdly, because we're two-legged, we tend to grasp things, either to fight or to love. We grasp things because we have our hands free. So any exercise which incorporates all the 3 is particularly good for dementia. So we did a study, and we found that tango of all dances was really the best form, and it showed an improvement in Parkinson's and reduced the risk of dementia because it was a walk fundamentally. It was you were balancing on a partner, you were grasping them. And so it had all the elements. So that's why even cycling people find helps because it balanced, two-legged. Right, but typically tango had the added advantage that you had a partner. So even other dances, like for example, Celtic dances, Indian dances, all those are helpful. So, I was in Dublin last year, and they asked me, what's your next book about? And I told them this, and I said, I'm going to give you a reason why we can finally forgive you guys for river dance. I may not forgive flatly, but at least we can, yeah, yeah.
So you mentioned a little while ago that we can eat for our gene type.
Yeah.
So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You can just take common things. So, for example, let's just take coffee. So, you see, one of the problems medicine hasn't caught up with nutritional genomics is because, like I said, medicine industry. So, it's a bit slow to move, and you don't really want to do too much preventative health because then you'd run out of business. So the way to look at it is, let's take a common gene. So, for the public, it's quite confusing because you may read a study which says one day coffee is good for you, and another day you read a report and it says coffee is bad for you. Same with alcohol. Is it good? Is it bad? Somebody says it's very good for your heart, and somebody says it raises your blood pressure. And the real issue is because you haven't put your individual gene types into the mix. So what I found is when I first looked at coffee, you get a U-shaped curve. On one hand, there's an increase in heart disease. On one hand, there's a decrease in heart disease. And then you think, how is this possible? But when you put the gene type into the gene which detoxifies caffeine, CYP-A12, the curve splits bang in the middle. So you have half the people who are fast metabolizers for whom actually drinking coffee is very good for migraines, for pain relief, for your liver function. And for the other half who are slow metabolizers, you will increase your risk of heart disease and develop irregular heartbeats if you have more than 200 milligrams a day. And so strong coffee like Turkish coffee may have 150 milligrams. So if you have more than one a day, you would increase your risk of heart disease. So I think eating for gene type, like I say in it, it's like the salt gene. I know I have that. So if I have more salt, I'd end up with high blood pressure. But there are other people who can have all the salt and nothing's going to happen to them. They're just simple examples. But there are other things like the thing one which really interests me is vitamin C. Because we did a study on people, young people in their 20s and 30s. And again, if you have there's only one gene which breaks down vitamin C, GSTD1. And people have a wrong variant of it, a non-functioning variant. What happens is for these people, they don't absorb vitamin C, so they need to double their intake. But these were people in their 20s. And when we looked at the chart, in the next 10 to 20 years, they developed heart disease, diabetes, put on weight, just because they had lower vitamin C levels. And the vitamin C, as you know, is an antioxidant. So what we found is, for those people, all they need is eating an orange a day would keep the doctor away, an additional one, an extra orange. So literally, you can learn to eat for your gene type. And these are just 3 common examples, but they're the rest. And I'm not going to tell you the rest, so they can go and buy the book at the back, right?
So can I ask you this? These genes that give us diseases.
Yes.
Now, if we are survival of the fittest, why do these genes survive?
Yeah, I think there are 2 things. As Dawkins said, the book Selfish Genes. See, genes are just makers of protein. Right, so genes just produce proteins which are used for various functions. So the gene doesn't care what happens to you. Right, so I think I often like to think like, I think Shakespeare said that, destiny is within us, not in our stars. And I think genes are like that. So they're not your destiny. So you can change by your actions, you can switch on or off the right genes. So the first part of it is when you say survival of the fittest, and this was something people often say, the biological definition of fitness is different from the public perception. So if I say fitness and I ask what is fitness, everybody will say who's stronger here is the fittest. But biologically, your ability to pass on a gene is what is fitness. So the weaker people survived. See, human beings are now weaker than what we used to be. It's because, like I said, the brave ones went and fought the predators and they died. So the weaker ones were actually fitter when it comes to propagating the gene. So the anxiety gene, the stress gene, all of those comes from our inherent weakness. But within it comes our strength in that we actually have the ability. So we can actually eat, we know foods which, for example, will reduce your stress levels. So we know that you can eat certain foods which will stimulate your dopamine. So we know you can eat certain antioxidants which will overall make you fitter and healthier. So I think what these food and what our actions do is they actually propagate, they turn on the good genes and they suppress the bad genes.
I also read that you are inspired by nature and that you inspired by the spiral pattern that we see in pine cones and in galaxies and flowers, that you have come up with a plastic surgery technique based on it, because there's apparently a whorl at the back of the human head.
Oh, yes, yeah. Oh, very good reading. I didn't even know you would have
I've been staying
heard
up
about
late.
it.
Ask my family.
Yeah. That wasn't even in the book, so she's done very good research. You know, it was really, I think by nature I'm just curious, so I was just looking at different things. So what I found is that when I was operating on animals, I realized that none of the animals have the whorl pattern on the back of a scalp, you know, the way a hair goes into a spiral. But every single human being had that pattern. So we looked at why is it? And one of the theories is that from the 10th to 17th week of intrauterine life, when the baby's in the womb, the brain expands dramatically. And because the brain expands dramatically and the bones are not fused, the skin sort of shears, because you've got two top layers of skin, epidermis and dermis. So when they shear, the hair follicles are in the dermis, so they tilt. So that was the theory. So then I thought, can I experimentally prove it? So because my main work is reconstructive surgery, we used saline expanders with which we could expand tissue. So we used animal skins and we tried pumping up the skin to see what happens to the top two layers. And we found that in fact, every time we expanded something rapidly, we got a spiral pattern. But if you expanded something slowly, you didn't get the pattern. So that's why you see that pattern in nature in galaxies or hurricanes. I mean, you don't see it in a piddly rain shower, right? But the reason for it is because it's nature's pattern for rapid expansion. So what I thought next was I used a corollary of that is, if that's nature's pattern for expansion, can I use a surgical technique based on that pattern to indeed stretch skin more efficiently to close defects on the scalp after, you know, tumors or injuries? And so that's one of the new operations I've developed.
Okay, so should we open it up to questions from the audience, or I could maybe after some questions, if we have time, ask you a few more. Yes,
Sure.
Lady in the red, do you have mics there? Okay.
So where do the Chinese come from?
Where do they come from, you mean?
Yeah, I understood the black and white.
Yes.
So I'm just asking, where do the Chinese come
Yeah,
from?
basically, the migration into Asia was all around the same time. But basically, the only subtle differences in color is because of, in India, we have much more sun than northern parts of China. So it's really, most of the migration originally was in the north, and then the people drifted down. So that's why you go further down towards Thailand and Indonesia, the same type of physical features, but the skin is darker. So it's just fundamentally migration of people, preservation of folic acid. Wherever the UV index fundamentally determines how your skin evolves. So for example, in Australia and New Zealand, in about 2,000 years from now, if we haven't destroyed the planet, the Europeans, which are fundamentally the most common population, they will have skin like Asians.
The lady in the red.
Yeah, I think in the best way that literature and discussion can throw light on so many issues, your talk has really been very illuminating in terms of the issues that we've covered. But one of the things that I kind of found myself immediately responding to was, in terms of our genes, yes, there is something that we control, but it is also about the society, the global society we live in, where multinationals actually perpetuate myths that get us to eat the rubbish that we eat, that basically multinationals get us to do half the things that are not in our best interests. So we have a political system such as in Britain, we have a National Health Service. Long live the National Health Service. But we are still, in terms of people living in Britain, debating whether to support a government that is going to destroy the national health system. So in that same vein, I think that understanding our genes and our health is also about understanding the politics of the world we live in.
But also, I don't know if that was a question, but I'll give you an answer. But you see, one of the things is, you're right about it. In sometimes, as a student of this, you find you can see the politics or the the business behind the genes. So for example, let's just take fizzy drinks, sugary drinks, right? So Coke or Pepsi, whatever. So what people don't realize is what caffeine does. Why do we have caffeine in those drinks? So the thing is, when I tested caffeine under different taste receptors in the tongue, so caffeine dulls your sweet taste receptors by 25%, right? So what I'm trying to get at is if you had a glass of Coke with caffeine and you managed to decaffeinate it right in front and then you try to drink it, you could not drink it because it would be far too sweet for you. So, but why do we need so much sugar? Because sugar acts on the same opiate receptors. So in other words, if coffee works on adenosine receptors, which are different. So if you wanted to come cold turkey of coffee, you could do it in 7 to 12 days. After that, you'll be fine. But sugar, you can't come off for 2 months because it's like coming off morphine. You're going to get the shakes, you're going to get it. So the higher the dose, the more addicted you're going to be. So you can't get off drinking it. But the interesting thing is, you normally wouldn't be able to drink such a high enough dose which would make you addicted unless you added caffeine. So it's actually quite interesting what you said is because like I said, I'm just a scientist. I don't have any bias. I'm just stepping back and looking at it. And I find it quite interesting. I said it could be intentional. It could be accidental discovery. But it just is quite interesting that, you know, the doses we end up with after adding caffeine in these drinks are the doses which make it more addictive that you can't stop drinking. So.
Next question at the back. Yeah. The lady in white.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It's super interesting. So I used to live in Seattle, and it's a very dark climate, and so there was a widespread recommendation that, you know, everyone should take vitamin D. And I moved here, and same recommendation for my private practitioner, and for my daughter too. And I'm just wondering, is that recommendation differentiated based on what you're saying on your gene type, or is it gone overboard and requiring everybody to do this?
Yeah, I think the part of the issue is that we don't, because of various reasons, we're not getting the vitamin D as nature intended. So let me give you an example. So for example, in India, like I said, because of the misconception in Asia, people don't want to get tanned. So people don't go out in the sun, so they don't get the vitamin D. Now, if you take fair-skinned people or white-skinned people like in Australia, New Zealand, even in Southern America, they're concerned of skin cancer or aging, so they don't go in the sun enough as well. So then the people then go out in the sun. You need roughly 20% of your body exposed for 20 minutes a day to absorb enough vitamin D. So 20% of a body, if you look at how you calculate for burns, that's roughly T-shirts and shorts. But many people just go and expose just their face or just their hands, so you're not going to get enough vitamin D absorption. So because of all these factors, you're right that most people don't get enough vitamin D. But having said that, like I said, for a vitamin C, we do test for a vitamin D gene where some people need to actually have vitamin D because they have more propensity to not produce enough vitamin D. So there is a subgroup. So normally we would still recommend that if you're taking a pill, then I would definitely suggest that you test your blood levels before you take it. If you're just eating in natural form, then it doesn't matter. So you see, for example, salmon and cod, for example, if you eat fish, they have 1,200 international units of vitamin D per teaspoon. So if you're eating salmon twice a day of that kind of oily fish, because other fish have omega-3 but not vitamin D, then you're fine. But if you had that particular gene type where you were likely to have a low vitamin D, then you would need a supplement. But if you didn't have the gene type and you were overdoing your vitamin D, like I said, it's a calcium regulator, then you could end up with too much calcium, which could cause other problems. So I would say if you're taking anything artificially, like a pill, then you must test your levels. And that's for most things. See, because you can't overdose. You can overdose on vitamins and you can get hypervitaminosis, but you can't overdose if you're eating it in a natural form. So you can eat all the oranges you want, but after a while, all will happen is you'll start excreting it. So you'll absorb all the vitamin C you can, and after that, all that happens is your urine becomes very expensive. But you see, and you might want to bottle it and sell it. But what really happens is beyond a point, you can't absorb more, but it's not the same with pills. So you want to be careful.
Okay, yes, the lady in front.
Hi. I found this talk, especially the emphasis on vitamin D, very interesting because there just seems to be a lot of awareness we are not getting enough vitamin D, and I've heard that TB, there's a lot of recurrence of TB in the UK and India, and sometimes it's caused by vitamin D deficiency. I'm just wondering, how is it? I'm just wondering where the interest in vitamin D is coming from, you know? How come there's so much research there in vitamin D? Everybody's waking up and saying, oh, we're not getting enough of it. Was there something that set it off, or was that just natural discovery?
I'd like to think that it was my book a few years ago, but actually it's probably more a natural discovery. But it's really around the time, it's really medicine has neglected it. But what we know is this, because my original research into vitamin D started because of the fact that vitamin D and sunlight, and my specialty is skin cancer. So we were looking at skin cancer and the relationship between vitamin D levels. So what we know is this, like I said, vitamin D is a very ancient hormone. It's not a vitamin, like I said, it's really a hormone. So vitamin D is a calcium regulating hormone. But we know now that calcium is so important for metabolism in various parts that vitamin D just represents a steady state. So we know now, I've looked at this link between cancer and vitamin D. There's no direct link. The link is more that if you have poor vitamin D levels, then you will do worse. So sometimes when you have advanced cancer, your vitamin D levels look low because whatever is happening, your antioxidants are also using up some of your vitamin D. So what we know now is vitamin D represents a healthy state. It's actually a very useful, it's like a miracle vitamin. It does so many different things. So it's a hormone, which is very essential. But if you don't have enough of it, it can lead to other things, and it lowers your immune response. And because of it, you then have, so it doesn't actually cause anything. It's just more the fact that if you don't have enough, you don't have a healthy state.
Any other questions? Yes. She'll just pass the mic to you.
With all your discoveries, are we going to live longer? Do you see us living 100 years onwards?
Well, like I said, you know, as it is, human beings, we know that we're living longer. Certainly in most of the Western countries anyway, we've got large aging populations. But it's one thing, living longer is not the same as living well and healthy longer. And I think my message here is really, as I say in the book, see, I've been a doctor now for 30 years. And touch wood, I've never lost a working day because of illness. And I like to think it's because I practice what I preach. So the fundamental thing is, I think living long is fine, but you've got to do all these things and make life fun. So like I said, we know different forms of exercise, for example, do different things. So like I said earlier, exercise involved balance and walking are good for dementia. We know Tai Chi kind of exercise is good for balance. We know yoga is good for stress relief and blood pressure. Different things do different things. So you can do different forms of exercise. You can eat different forms of foods. And of course, you can live longer and healthier and be in full control of your faculties. But I think the main reason why we live longer now is because we have less infection. We have cleaner water. But unfortunately, our biggest risk to our health in the future, other than us eating badly and living badly, is really the environment. And that's unfortunately a terrible thing because as human beings, we've lost our instinct. And what I say is, how crazy is it that we have to be an activist to fight for our own environment? You know, if you put a crocodile in an area which is overpopulated, the crocodile buries eggs at a different level so they produce more males so they don't get overpopulated. But we don't have that instinct. You know, we can't even mention, and I've been at medical things and I say the biggest threat to health in the future is our environment. But people look at you as like you're some activist, you see. So I think, yeah. So all I do now is, okay, forget the external environment because I'm not a politician. All I can worry about is the internal environment. So hence, that's this thing about diet and exercise is all about controlling your own bodily internal environment. How old am I? I'm 50. I'm 51.
You know, yes? Just one
I
second.
can't hear
She'll
you.
get you the mic.
Hello? I just wanted to ask, though, over time, wouldn't pollution affect the genes? Like, we're putting all the chemicals and stuff into the atmosphere. isn't this going to affect our genes just like how in the past we've got the genes are being affected from what our ancestors have done?
So you're saying does
Like the
couldn't get fully,
environment,
are you saying does pollution affect our genes? Yeah, absolutely.
Like I've lived in London all my life.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
Like, I have asthma.
Yep.
That's affected by the environment.
Absolutely.
And like I go exercise, but then I'm breathing in more of the pollution and the environment.
Yep.
So over times where my genes change because of that.
Yes. So basically, it's like we know that, see, most diseases are environment and genetics. So nothing is absolute. So for example, you may have a particular gene which protects you a bit. But generally speaking, the more polluted it is, the more toxins are going into your system. So you're using up a lot of your antioxidants fighting it. So you suppress your immune system. So to combat it, then you need to eat right, do things so you can. But you're right, it is a risk. The more polluted places you have, the more negative health effects you have. Especially even things like stress. We even have a link between pollution and not just things like asthma, which are more obvious, but we have a thing between places which are more polluted and increase in stress levels. You put mice where they pumped in polluted air. This was a very interesting study done where they put mice in a cage and they pumped in a simulated air of a major city. I think they actually said it was a bit of London and a bit of New York combination. And what they found is these mice started expressing genes which made them more overweight, made them more stressed, and made them more unhappy. So we know that we do have all these effects. And that's what I was saying, you know, at least we can try and control our own internal environment by taking charge of our own health. And of course, we need to battle, you know, the politics and the industry in fighting pollution.
You know, one very chilling visual from this book that has stayed with me is how you say we're constantly evolving, and now we're evolving to just check our laptops hunched over our phones. And that, to me, is a very chilling visual of where the human race is perhaps headed if we don't change track. So I think we're almost done for time. Thank you very much, Dr. Paul,
Pleasure.
for being with us.
Thank you so much. Pleasure.
We'd like to thank both Dr. Paul and Ms. Mahtani for this session.